It was exactly 5:30 in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Dawn had not yet broken when an extraordinary commotion began outside Captain Ibrahim Traoré's private residence. Dozens of military vehicles were silently lined up. Hundreds of soldiers were completing their final preparations. No one yet knew that the next 48 hours would change the fate of West Africa, create an earthquake effect in international diplomacy, and occupy the headlines of the world press for weeks to come. Traoré, perhaps, could not fully grasp the dimensions of the decision he made that morning. But as he worked at his desk throughout the night, looking at the map in front of him, the French military base stationed in the heart of Burkina Faso's territory, just 30 kilometers from the capital, seemed to challenge him like a defiant symbol. Convoy base had been the largest symbol of French military presence in Burkina Faso since 2022, and Traoré had decided to confront this symbol that very morning. The preparation of the convoy took exactly 3 hours. 150 military vehicles, 3,000 soldiers, and the most modern equipment of the Burkina Faso army were mobilized. Traoré's decision to make such a large show of force had crystallized after the intelligence reports he received in the hours bridging night and morning. What was written in the report had deeply shaken both Traoré and his close circle. The routes of aircraft departing from the French base over the last 2 weeks, secret meetings held at the base, and, most importantly, the mysterious guest who had arrived at the base just last night. Everything confirmed Traoré's suspicions. At 6 a.m., the convoy moved out. The sound of military vehicles rolling through Ouagadougou's quiet streets began to awaken the city. The people looking out from their windows had never before seen such large-scale military activity. And when the first photos began circulating on social media, the question on everyone's mind was the same: where was the convoy heading? But when Traoré's determined facial expression was captured through the window of the leading armored vehicle, it became clear this morning would not be an ordinary one. Convoy base had begun its usual routine with the first light of dawn. French soldiers moved to breakfast after their morning exercises. Radar operators were at their posts. The base commander, Colonel Marc Dubois, was receiving the day's first intelligence summary, as he did every morning. But this morning was different. The first signals from the radar showed that a large convoy was approaching the base. Dubois' first assumption was that it was a routine Burkina Faso army exercise. After all, there were coordination protocols between the two countries' armed forces. However, the size and direction of the convoy quickly set off alarm bells. The first report, arriving at the base at 7:15 a.m., was shocking. The convoy was heading directly toward Convoy base, and no coordination request had been received. Dubois immediately tried to reach the military attaché in Ouagadougou. The phone kept ringing, but no one answered. This was not normal. Not normal at all. At 7:30 a.m., the first elements of the convoy reached the outer perimeter security points of Convoy base. Traoré's vehicle was at the front, followed by a seemingly endless stream of military vehicles and soldiers. The French security forces didn't know how to respond, waiting for orders from their superiors. This exact scenario had never been covered in any existing security protocol, and now they were facing the de facto leader of Burkina Faso. When Traoré stepped out of his vehicle, the silence that surrounded him was deafening. French soldiers were unsure how to hold their weapons, while the Burkina soldiers stood firmly behind their commander. There were only a few meters between the two countries' armed forces, but this distance felt like kilometers. At that moment, phones began ringing in various European capitals, while an emergency meeting was being called at the Élysée Palace in Paris. A red alert was activated at NATO headquarters in Brussels and at the Pentagon in Washington. The Africa desk began monitoring developments minute by minute. The world didn't yet know what was happening at this small French base in the heart of Burkina Faso. But everyone would learn its name in the coming hours. Traoré stood in front of the main gate of the French base. Behind him were 3,000 soldiers. In front of him stood bewildered French security forces. In his hand, he held an official document, and the contents of that document would create an earthquake effect in world diplomacy just a few hours later. The document was not a Burkina Faso government request for the French military presence to withdraw from the country's territory. This was something much different, much bolder, and much riskier. At 8 a.m., Traoré began speaking through a megaphone. He wanted to ensure his voice reached every corner of the base. The first sentence of his speech would shock both the French soldiers and the world. "I am Captain Ibrahim Traoré, speaking on behalf of the people of Burkina Faso. This base is now under the control of the Burkina Faso army." The moment this sentence was uttered, phones around the world began going crazy. Colonel Dubois was drenched in sweat when he heard Traoré's words. The 57-year-old experienced officer had seen many crises during his 30-year career in the French army. He had served in Mali, Afghanistan, Iraq, but he had never encountered a situation like this. Facing him wasn't an enemy force, but the leader of a country that was supposed to be an ally. International law, diplomacy, NATO protocols, none of them provided guidance for such a scenario. Dubois' first reflex was to immediately call Paris, but the phone lines were jammed at the Élysée Palace, at the Foreign Ministry, and at the Defense Ministry. Everyone was trying to receive the same news at the same time. It was 8:15 in the morning, and France's top officials had just finished their breakfast. No one was prepared to face such a surprise. Traoré continued his speech through the megaphone. His voice was calm but determined. "These lands are Burkina Faso territory. All personnel and equipment located at this base will be kept under the security of the Burkina Faso army. No one will be harmed. However, the status of this base has now changed." Whispers began rising among the French soldiers. Some wanted to reach for their weapons, but their commanders had not yet given orders. Dubois knew he couldn't make such a critical decision alone. A clash between the 400 French soldiers at the base and the 3 Burkina soldiers facing them wouldn't just be a local disaster, it could be the beginning of an international war. Meanwhile, media members began gathering around the base. Local television channels had set off toward Convoy. Following clues they received from social media, the first live broadcast came from Burkina Faso television. Viewers who saw the size of the convoy couldn't hide their astonishment. Commentators didn't know what to say because such a thing had never happened before. When the first videos began to be shared on social media, it started attracting attention worldwide. The hashtags #KAMBO in Sin, #Traoré, #Burkina Faso began trending across West Africa and started to be followed in Europe and the United States as well. BBC, CNN, France 24 editors began preparing to send emergency news teams at 8:30. An emergency meeting began at the Élysée Palace in Paris. President Emmanuel Macron, the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, Foreign Minister, and intelligence chiefs gathered around the table. The atmosphere in the room was tense and uncertain. As questions flew from every direction, confusion reigned in Paris. What exactly did Traoré want? Was this just a show of force, or something more? What would become of the French soldiers stationed there? And how would the global community respond? Amid the uncertainty, President Macron gave one decisive order at the emergency meeting: ensure the safety of French military personnel, avoid provocation, but preserve the dignity of France. Simple on the surface, the directive was layered with complexity. Just how much could France back down without losing face? How far could they go to meet Traoré's demands without appearing weak simultaneously? In Brussels, NATO convened a high-level meeting. Tensions simmered as the situation at Kati base was placed on the agenda. Cracks began to show between allies. Germany and Italy pushed for a diplomatic approach, while the UK and the US favored a firmer stance. Meanwhile, Traoré stood at the base gates, his forces already in formation. This wasn't random posturing, it was a meticulously executed operation. Burkina Faso's top military officers had surrounded the base within minutes. Every exit was secured. Their airspace, too, was now under surveillance. By 9 a.m., Colonel Dubois managed to establish a line with Paris. The orders were clear: do not escalate. Protect the French personnel and, above all, try to negotiate. It was a relief. In part, at least bloodshed might be avoided. But for Dubois, it was also a heavy burden. He had no idea how to negotiate with a man like Traoré. As he stepped toward the front gate, flanked by two officers, Dubois understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a turning point for relations between two nations. On the other side stood Traoré.com and Collected. There, eyes met for the first time, under the gaze of thousands of soldiers. Dubois opened in French, but Traoré replied in English, a subtle yet powerful symbol of shifting influence. Colonel Dubois, Traoré began, there are things we need to talk about. First, let me assure you, neither you nor your men are in danger. Let's handle this cooperatively. Dubois replied with diplomatic restraint, but there was a trace of desperation in his voice. Captain Traoré, this base is protected under international treaties. What you're doing risks sparking a diplomatic crisis. Traoré smiled, not arrogantly, but with quiet resolve. Colonel, that crisis has already begun. We're just trying to fix it. Even as they spoke, media outlets from around the world were rushing to the scene. International agencies like Reuters, AP, and AFP mobilized their nearest correspondents toward Kati. The story had officially gone global. At 10 a.m., the French Foreign Ministry issued its first public statement. Brief, measured, and cautious. We are closely monitoring developments in Burkina Faso. The safety of our personnel remains a top priority. We hope for a diplomatic resolution. The statement reflected France's precarious position, caught between showing strength and avoiding provocation. Any misstep could risk the lives of their soldiers, and they knew it. Too soft a statement could undermine France's prestige. The African Union also began convening during these hours. At the O headquarters in Addis Ababa, ambassadors of member countries requested an emergency meeting. The developments at Kati base were not just a Burkina Faso, France issue, but a situation that could affect the future of all Africa. The first meeting between Traoré and Dubois lasted 1 hour. In this meeting, Traoré clearly laid out his demands. These demands included the transfer of Kati base to the Burkina Faso army, a timeline for the withdrawal of French military presence from the country, and full independence in Burkina Faso's security policies. Dubois responded that he could not directly meet these demands and needed to consult with Paris. Traoré stated that he was patient but determined. I am giving you 24 hours, Colonel. You can consult with your superiors during this time. This 24-hour period was of critical importance for world diplomacy. France, NATO, the EU, and the UN all activated simultaneously. Diplomatic channels began working rapidly. Telephone diplomacy reached its peak in Paris. Macron called Angela Merkel, trying to seek Germany's support from Berlin. However, Germany's response was cold. Merkel had long criticized France's Africa policy and believed this crisis was the result of problems France had created for itself. In London, Boris Johnson displayed a more supportive attitude, but there was not much the UK could practically do. Post-Brexit, Britain had lost much of its influence in Europe. In Washington, the situation was more complex. The Biden administration was concerned about the growing influence of China and Russia in Africa. They were calculating whether Traoré's move would further strengthen that influence. At 14 o'clock hours in the afternoon, a second development occurred. At Kati base, Traoré announced that he wanted to speak with the French soldiers inside the base. This request put Dubois in a very difficult position. His soldiers' morale was already low. Traoré speaking directly to them could cause even more confusion. However, Traoré's request could not be refused. Through the loudspeaker system, set up in the base courtyard, Traoré addressed the French soldiers. His speech was a mixture of English and French. "Dear soldiers, we have no personal hostility toward you. You are doing your duty, and we are protecting our own country's interests. Your safety is guaranteed throughout this process. You may communicate with your families, your basic needs will be met." This speech found wide resonance in the international media. Traoré's gentlemanly behavior neutralized propaganda efforts trying to portray him as an aggressive leader. The hashtag respectful resistance began trending on social media. By the evening hours, the number of journalists camping around Kati base exceeded 100. International media began covering the crisis minute by minute. BBC World, CNN International, France 24 RT and Al Jazeera all attempted to broadcast live from Kati. This media attention worked to Traoré's advantage. Global public opinion was witnessing the developments firsthand. It was clear to everyone that the French soldiers were not being harmed, that Traoré was behaving respectfully, and that the situation remained under control. At 20 o'clock hours, a second emergency meeting was held in Paris. Macron's stress was clearly visible during the meeting. France was now under pressure, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, the French public was deeply concerned about the safety of its soldiers. Internationally, the scrutiny was even greater. Support from allies was less than expected. 3 different options were discussed in the meeting. First, trying to retake the base through military intervention. However, this option was considered too risky. Second, negotiating with Traoré to make a gradual withdrawal plan. Third, involving the international community to exert diplomatic pressure. Macron preferred the second option. France's prestige was important, but the safety of French soldiers was more important. A negotiable withdrawal plan would both save the soldiers and preserve France's honor. This decision was communicated to Dubois at midnight. Second-round negotiations with Traoré would begin the next morning. In these negotiations, France was revealing its intention to step back for the first time. On the morning of the second day, the atmosphere around Kati base had changed. The media had relatively calmed down. Hopes for a diplomatic solution had increased. Traoré agreed to meet with Dubois early in the morning. In this second meeting, Dubois spoke with the authority. He had received from Paris, "Captain Traoré, my government is open to negotiation. However, we want some guarantees, safe withdrawal of French personnel, the status of equipment, and future cooperation possibilities." Traoré's response was positive. "Colonel, we also want to be constructive. Gradual withdrawal within 3 months, safe transfer of valuable equipment, and cooperation on the basis of equal partnership in the future are possible." This negotiation process was detailed in the afternoon. Both sides brought in their lawyers and diplomats. International media announced this development as the Great Reconciliation. In the evening hours, a preliminary agreement was signed. Traoré and Dubois shook hands in front of the world press. This photograph became a symbol of a new era in Africa-Europe relations. 3 months later, the last French soldier also left Burkina Faso. Kati base was transferred to the Burkina Faso army. Traoré gained international prestige during this process. His position in African leadership was strengthened. France, on the other hand, learned important lessons from this crisis. It decided to review its Africa policy. It understood that habits from the colonial period could no longer be sustained. The Kati crisis produced both local and global results. Locally, Burkina Faso's independence was consolidated. Globally, a new paradigm began in Africa-Europe relations. This crisis also showed how modern diplomacy works. Social media, international media, and public opinion pressure all influenced the course of the crisis. Traditional diplomacy alone was no longer sufficient. Traoré's strategy was not just using military force. Media management, public opinion support, international image. He had calculated all of them. This was one of the factors that made him successful. In conclusion, the Gadi-based crisis became an example of how small countries could struggle against great powers in the 21st century. With smart strategy, media support, and correct use of international public opinion, David could defeat Goliath. This story showed Africa's changing face and the bold steps of its young leaders. Traoré had made a move that would affect not only his country, but the entire continent, and this move had been successful in a way that would go down in history. The Gadi-based crisis would henceforth be taught in international relations courses, studied in diplomatic academies, and become a reference point in African studies, because this crisis was not just a disagreement between two countries, it had become a symbol of the changing dynamics of the age.